Hello and welcome to my channel. In this one I'm going to do a simple drawing in pastel, and I'm going to show you how you can create a feeling of depth and distance with very little detail and a limited number of colors. This is the paper I'm going to be working on. This is the UART 800 sanded paper. It's going to be a slightly larger drawing this time, about 8 inches in height and 14 inches in width. So a slightly larger landscape than usual. The first thing I'm going to do is a simple sketch with a graphite pencil. The sky takes up a large portion of this drawing, so I want to know where the mountains will be. After that I'm going to start working on the sky, and I'm going to use a couple of pastel pencils. The reason why I picked pastel pencils rather than soft pastels was simply because I didn't have the colors that I wanted in the soft pastel range. My range is kind of limited, I have very few colors, so I picked these two pastel pencils. All of the pastels and pastel pencils that I'm going to use are Kohinoor pastels. So I'm going to use Kohinoor soft pastels and Kohinoor pastel pencils. Right now I'm working with pastel pencils. And I started playing around with a couple of blue pastel pencils, something like a middle phthalo blue and the light ultramarine pastel pencil, and on top of that I used a little bit of black pastel pencil. I have to use a very small amount of black pastel pencil because it's very overpowering. After that I started blending. The reason why I combined these two pastel pencils was because the first one, the phthalo blue, is a little bit too warm and I wanted something a bit cooler. So I thought by combining these two I would get something that is closer to what I wanted. The reference photo will be in the description as usual, but don't expect to see the same shapes or the same colors that you see there. So mine is going to be a little bit different, but the idea, the general idea, is similar. So after that I'm blending all of this, and I'm going to be blending with my finger. It's the quickest and easiest way to blend, especially when you have to blend larger areas. So as you can see, by adding that black pastel pencil I got a slightly darker and duller color. Now that I was more or less happy with the results, I'm moving on to the middle and the right side of the scene, which I also need to cover thoroughly with pastel pencils. Once again, I understand that this would be much faster with soft pastels, but pastel pencils are also relatively fast to work with. They're definitely much faster than colored pencils, so it's not a problem. It's going to be over in a matter of minutes anyway. All I need to do is make sure that I cover it thoroughly, because you often end up with too little material on the paper with this type of paper. I'm putting down the light ultramarine on top of this one. I'm going to use the same combination of colors, but as you can see here I'm trying to cover the paper a bit more thoroughly and to get a bit more material in there, because one of the things that I noticed when I was blending the left side of the scene was that a lot of those light portions of the paper were showing through, and I realized that I needed more material. I simply need more pigment in there. And you can see that now that I'm blending this middle and the right portion of the sky, it's blending a bit more smoothly. That's because less of the paper is showing through. So I'm going to try to rework the left side as well and push a little bit more dust in there so that it would look smoother, so that I could remove that texture. That's one of the things that you'll just have to accept when you're experimenting with new papers, especially these sanded papers. It's kind of difficult to predict how much of the material you need to put down, because you art really grips a lot of that pastel dust, and sometimes it can seem like you have enough of it, but you often need to put a little bit more to get a smooth blending and to overcome the background color as well, if the color is a lot different than the color that you're trying to create. Anyway, I'm going to draw some scattered clouds now in the top left part of the scene, and for that I'm going to use a light pinkish color. This is something like a light beige red. So it's a light beige with a slight reddish component to it. And I'm going to add a few of these wispy clouds in the top left part. I need to put down enough of this so that it would overcome the darker layers in the background. And I'm going to put another smaller cloud, or a smaller group of clouds, here in the middle as well, kind of detached slightly from the rest. After that, I'm just going to dab on that gently and blend a little bit in order to remove those lines and make these actually look more like clouds, but also to make them look a little bit more wispy and transparent around the edges. I didn't really want to fix the drain in between the layers, because there are advantages to not fixing it as well, but it does make things a little bit messier at times. So I'm just playing around with the shape of these clouds until I get them to look sort of realistic. I added some more pinkish tones and now a little bit of white pastel to the lower part of some of these shapes, because I want it to look like they are catching light from below, because I'm going to have a sunrise lower down on the right side. So I'm just adding a touch of white here and there. Here at the bottom I'm going to apply some light blue soft pastel. I didn't really want to use this one from the beginning, even though it would have been a bit quicker, but if I combined that with a black pastel, I would end up with a very dull grayish color, and I didn't really want to achieve that effect. So I'm just going to add a little bit of that here at the bottom, because I want to achieve a little bit of a gradient with the sky. I want the sky to be lighter here near the horizon and to be a bit darker at the top. And I want a very smooth transition, so I'm going to try to blend that nicely with my finger. And I can't make it too light, which is why I'm making sure that they are blended well. In this bottom portion I'm going to add some warmer colors where the sunrise will be. I added a very light orangey color, and then even a touch of some reddish brown, and then I blended that. Now it looks a little bit too dark, but those are just some of the colors that I thought I saw in the reference, so I wanted to replicate something similar. But I realized that this was a little bit too dark and maybe a little bit too warm, so I added a touch of other colors and decided to blend it a little bit more to try to make it a bit lighter. I applied that lighter pastel on top once again and blended that and made a smooth transition towards those bluish areas, and now I think it's closer to what I actually wanted to achieve. With that lighter pastel pencil I'm also going to add a suggestion of the rising sun here in the distance. And maybe add a touch of white to make it a little bit brighter. Just a hint of it. And then I'm going to start working on those mountain peaks in the distance. Of course, I'm going to start with a black pastel pencil. I know that the tip of it looks a little bit bluish, but that's because it picked up a bit of that blue pastel while I was working on the top part of the scene. But it is a black pastel pencil. I'm going to use that to draw those mountain peaks, their upper edge, and I'm going to shade them with a black pastel lightly, because I don't want to put too much of the black pastel. As I've already mentioned, the black pastel is kind of overpowering, so I'm going to use less pressure and put down a little bit less of that material, and then put some blue on top of that to create a bluish effect on those distant mountain peaks. So what I'm trying to accomplish with that is I'm trying to create an atmospheric effect where the objects in the distance appear more vague and more bluish, whereas the ones that are closer to us are darker with more contrast, more detail, and some warmer colors. This scene is going to be relatively simple, but we're going to create depth by manipulating the amount of value in those distant mountains. So basically I'm going to create several layers of those mountains, each of which is going to be darker than the previous one, and that way we're going to create that feeling of distance in the scene. So I'm drawing the second group, or the second layer of mountains in front of these, and here I'm going to use a little bit more of the black pastel. This looks pitch black, but it's not going to be pitch black. First I'm going to lay down the black pastel. You can already see this group of mountains looks closer to our viewpoint than the ones behind it. I'm adding a little bit of blue on top of that, and now I'm going to blend that. So like I said, I don't want it completely black, but it's very dark, especially in comparison to those mountains in the back. And we also have a huge contrast now between the sky, that lighter part of the sky at the bottom, and the rest of the sky as well. So just by adding those darker shapes in the midground and the foreground, we're creating a lot of contrast and tension between the sky and the lower part of the scene, the mountains. But I keep adding a little bit of blue to this because I want it a bit duller and a little bit less dark than it is now. Now for the foreground area, for this slope in the foreground that is going to be in front of everything else pretty much, I'm going to go with really dark tones. So this is going to be really black. And if you feel like you can't get it to look dark enough, you can either use a black soft pastel or even a charcoal stick or a charcoal pencil, if you want to make sure that you will create a sufficient amount of contrast between that top layer or a layer in the front, which needs to be the darkest. And of course I'm blending all of that thoroughly with my finger because I really don't need any detail here in this part of the scene. It's all going to be very dark. I'm going to add a touch of green pastel here and there, maybe try to create a really dark green color, but I'm not even sure if the camera will be able to pick up these slight variations in color. It's mostly pretty dark. So you can see now we've created several layers of mountains and we've created that feeling of depth in the scene. Now to further make the scene more interesting, I'm going to add a large tall tree here in the foreground. It's going to be a fir tree. If you look at my reference, the shape is going to be a little bit different. I wanted a slightly more elongated, taller, tapering shape, so I'm going to draw something a little bit different than what you see in the reference. And here I'm actually using a charcoal pencil. I'm using a woodless charcoal pencil. Now I could have used the pastel pencil, because charcoal and pastel are very similar materials and they do combine pretty well. But the thing is that charcoal pencils that I have, they're a little bit easier to sharpen, and I think they're a little bit darker. So I wanted something that's going to make very dark marks and very sharp marks. And I can't really sharpen my pastel pencils all the way because most of my sharpeners are kind of dull at the moment, and I'm afraid that I would cause a lot of breakage. So I just picked up one of the charcoal pencils. You don't have to do that, but I think it's just a little bit easier that way. And I think that charcoal pencils do combine pretty well with pastel pencils. Anyway, I'm making some progress with the shape of that fir tree, and I'm going to draw. I first drew that vertical shape, the vertical line, to show the height and the overall shape of the tree trunk, and now I'm adding those horizontal shapes. So branches growing out to the sides. They also have needles on them, or clusters of needles on them, and the ones that are at the top are kind of pointing more upwards, and the ones on the sides are pointing a little bit more to the side, and some of them at the bottom are even going to be drooping down a little bit because they're longer, larger and heavier. And obviously they're a lot more massive, there are more needles on them. That's why we're getting this conical tapering shape of a fir tree. So I just want to create something that looks like a pretty detailed silhouette of a tree. This is a part of the scene where I have to put in a little more effort and where I have to be a little bit more patient. The reason for that is because the rest of my scene is very simple. So I need to have something a little bit more detailed to impress you, which is why I added this tree. And even though it's just a silhouette of a tree, it's a very detailed one with lots of these branches and clusters of needles. And that's why I'm being patient here and putting in a little bit more effort to draw all of these tiny details, because like I said, I want a detailed looking fir tree. I want a more detailed element in that scene, something to entertain the eye of the viewer, rather than just layers of pastel without any detail or texture. And the other thing that I achieved with that tree is I added even more to the contrast and tension between the foreground and the background, because the tree now stands out very nicely against that lighter sky. I'm drawing another tree here to the left. This one is a little bit smaller, so I'm going to vary the size of those trees a little bit. I'm going to make some of them a little bit taller than others, some of them a bit smaller and shorter, because I want to make it look like some of them are a little bit further away, others are a bit closer to our viewpoint. The ones that are closer to our viewpoint are obviously going to appear much larger, like this large tree that I drew first. And now on that top edge of the slope in the foreground, I'm going to draw a bunch of these shapes of small trees in the distance. But I'm just doing a little bit more work on this fir tree here, this large one, because I want to rework its shape a little bit and add some more detail to it. And I think I like this shape a little bit better now. I'm just going to add a few more branches until I'm happy with the overall appearance. So this top edge of that slope still needs a bit more work, so I'm going to keep adding these shapes of trees. I'm going to vary both the shapes and the sizes of the trees. They don't have to they don't all have to look like fir trees. I can vary the shape a little bit. Some of them can be more like pine trees or whatever. And sometimes I'm not even drawing lines, sometimes I'm just drawing dots, because they're very far away, so we can barely see the details on them. But I want to create something that looks like those conical tapering shapes of of evergreen trees, of coniferous trees. Every now and then I draw one of them that stands out from the rest a little bit more, like it's a little bit closer to us on that slope. And now if you look at the whole scene, you will see we created a lot of contrast. We've created layers in that scene, and we really have a feeling of depth, like we can look far back into the distance. That's what I wanted to create, and that, as I've shown you, is not that difficult to create with very few colors and actually very little work, because you can do this in under an hour for sure, even when it's a larger size drawing. Anyway, the drawing is done. I'm going to put my signature in the lower left corner. Don't forget to check out my other videos and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to see the full-length version of the video and more content, check out my Patreon. Bye bye.